We are back after a short break, and I believe at this point we go to storage vessels. Ms. Katz.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. And I guess I just want to check and make sure that, because I know we were gonna close out, we were gonna try to wrap some things up and close out engines, but my understanding is that we only have one last engines witness, and he's not currently available until this afternoon. So I just wanted to make sure that that's correct.
Let me ask if anyone has other information there.
Madam Hearing Officer, that's correct. It'll be very short, and our witness will be available after this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is the department calls back Ms. Bisbee Keene and Mr. Palmer. This testimony pertains to section 20.2.50.123 of the rule, storage vessels. The written testimony appears in NMED Exhibit 32 on page 138, and NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 1 beginning on page 90. And this testimony has already been adopted by the witnesses, and I don't believe there are any corrections that need to be made. So, Ms. Keene, can you please discuss the equipment that is the subject of this section of the rule?
Yes, good morning, everyone. We're here this morning to discuss section 123 storage vessels. Storage vessels are used throughout the oil and gas sector for storing hydrocarbon liquids and produced water. They're used in production, gathering, processing, and disposal, and are significant sources of VOC emissions. Storage vessels may be installed as a single unit or in a group of similar or identical vessels, commonly referred to as a tank battery. Crude oil contains many light hydrocarbons in solution in the reservoir, and when brought to the surface, many of those dissolved lighter hydrocarbons, as well as water, are removed through a series of separators. Crude oil can be passed through a two-phase separator where the associated gas is removed and any oil and water remain together, or a three-phase separator where the associated gas is removed and then the oil and water are also separated. The remaining oil is then directed to a storage vessel where it is stored before being transported off-site, and much of the remaining hydrocarbon gases in the oil are released as vapors in the storage vessels. VOC emissions can occur from three different types of sources, and they're a function of flashing emissions, breathing, and working losses. Flashing losses occur when liquid with entrained hydrocarbons are transferred from a vessel with a higher pressure to a lower pressure, allowing entrained gases to vaporize or flash. Breathing losses are the release of gas associated with temperature fluctuations and the expansion and contraction of stored fluids, resulting from increased or decreased pressures associated with environmental and weather-related fluctuations. And finally, working losses occur when vapors are displaced due to the emptying and the filling of a storage vessel. And so it's these three different separate types of emissions combined that contribute to the overall emission profile of a storage vessel.
And Ms. Keene, can you discuss what options there are for controlling emissions from storage tanks?
Yes. The methods to reduce VOC emissions from storage vessels or tanks, which we're using interchangeably and can be used interchangeably. Owners and operators may route emissions from the storage vessel through an enclosed system to a process where those emissions are recycled or recovered. For example, by installing a vapor recovery unit that recovers vapors from the storage vessel. For reuse in the process or for beneficial use of the gas on site. Or they may route those emissions from a storage vessel to a combustion device. And we also heard testimony from other parties that there are additional types of controls available that we'll speak to later on.
Thank you. And I guess we've skipped over what we've normally done, which was to give the overview of the emissions standards. So I'll have Ms. Keene do that when we get to the actual rule language. Mr. Palmer, can you discuss what the estimated emission reductions and costs are for this part of the rule?
Sure. The estimated overall emission reductions from storage tanks are 7,739 tons per year of allowable VOC. The reductions are achieved at an estimated cost effectiveness of $2,695 per ton of VOC using combustors to control emissions. And this cost effectiveness was based on the 2016 CTG and the use of a combustor control, and also includes cost for tank retrofits to include a closed vent system.
And sorry, Mr. Palmer, do you have any discussion of where the basis for the rule provisions?
Sure. Yeah, the rule provisions parallel those. They're similar to the similar control requirements as in the NSPS and also Colorado Rule 7. And I also believe Pennsylvania general permits.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Keene, can you please discuss the definitions in section 7 of the rule that are related to the storage tank provisions and any revisions that were made to those?
Yes, the first definition is the definition of a storage vessel. We received requests from stakeholders to strike that language referring to a process vessel, such as a surge control vessel or bottom receiver or knockout vessel. The department agreed to strike those. Those are not intended to be covered as storage vessels, and that is consistent with the federal New Source Performance Standard, Quad A. We also received a comment to add in a PSI equivalent pressure. And so that was added in response to comments. NMOGRA, in terms of commencement of operation, that definition, the department received requests regarding that definition as well to strike the final language of the sentence, but no later than the end of well completion operation, and the department did not agree to that edit. This definition was taken from the Colorado Reg 7, and we are aligning those two definitions for this rule.
Thank you. And Ms. Keene, can you please discuss the applicability and emissions standards that apply to storage vessels under the rule, and how those have been, the revisions that have been made to those standards?
Yeah. Yes, I will. Similar to the other regulatory, the other sections that we reviewed, we have the applicability section, which identifies the types of storage vessels that are subject to this section. So new storage vessels with a potential to emit equal to or greater than 2 tons per year are subject to this rule. And existing storage vessels with the potential to emit equal to or greater than 3 tons per year are subject to this rule. So there's a different applicability threshold for new and existing storage vessels. The addition of the second sentence was a request also made by industry stakeholders to clarify that when storage vessels are manifolded together, those emissions may be routed either to an individual storage vessel or to storage vessels that are routed together. and that the PTE may be determined by averaging the emissions across the total number of storage vessels. So the emission standards, which are outlined in paragraph B, establish the emission reduction requirements. Existing storage vessels, again, with a PTE greater than 3 tons per year, shall reduce emissions of VOC by at least 95%, according to the following schedule. We agreed, it was requested that we have a staggered timeline or deadline for existing storage vessels. The department agreed that given the universe of storage vessels that this will affect, that a staggered compliance timeline or deadline is appropriate for existing storage vessels. So we have structured deadlines similar to what we have done for engines and turbines. By January 1st, 2024, owners or operators must ensure at least 35% of the company's existing storage vessels are controlled. And then again, by January 1st, 2026, at least an additional 35% of the company's existing storage vessels must be controlled. And then by January 1st, 2028, the remaining existing storage vessels are required to be controlled. We did, in our original filed version of the rule back in May, have a separate distinctive requirement for existing vessels that had a PTE greater than 10, and we had a higher control reduction requirement, and we have struck that requirement because that was it was not clear, and it's not, I don't think, technically feasible to meet that kind of emission reduction. And so we have rewritten this part to have the same reduction efficiency requirement for both new and existing storage vessels. So the new paragraph 2 identifies the requirement for new storage vessels. Again, those are storage vessels with potential to emit greater than 2 tons per year shall reduce their VOC emissions by at least 95% per year. And again, throughout this rule, if a combustion control device is used, the combustion device shall have a minimum design combustion efficiency of 98%. And we've made that edit throughout the rule, as you probably have noticed. Paragraph 4 is the equivalent requirement that we struck. The new paragraph 3 is an off-ramp for those storage vessels that have actual annual VOC emissions less than 2 tons per year. So if a tank has actual VOC emissions less than 2, they are no longer subject to the emission standards of this part. As an alternative, paragraph 4 allows owners and operators to shut in the well as an alternative to complying with the control requirements by the applicable date. There is a sunset clause included in this regulation, in this provision, that the owner or operator shall not resume production from the well until the control device is installed and operational. The new paragraph 5 discusses a requirement to have a pressure relief, thief hatch automatically close after it is open due to an overpressuring event. We had received comments from stakeholders about requesting some modifications to that language, which we agreed with. The intent of this provision is that any pressure relief valve installed must automatically close once the vessel overpressure is relieved. And so that has been clearly stated in that last sentence. And that's the intent of this section. And then the previous paragraph 8 has been deleted. That was the requirement to install an equipment monitoring tag. And then new paragraph 6 requires owners and operators that are using a control device to comply with the emission standards of this part to comply with those specific control device operational requirements in section 115. Paragraph C discusses the monitoring requirements for storage vessels. On a monthly basis, they're required to calculate or estimate or monitor directly the total monthly liquid throughput, and also the upstream separator pressure if the storage vessel is directly downstream of a separator. That was an important clarification that we are only seeking to know the upstream separator pressure if it is directly upstream of a tank. There's a clause also provided that when a storage vessel is loaded less frequently than monthly, that those two monitoring events shall be conducted when or before the storage vessel is unloaded. Owners and operators are also required to conduct an AVO inspection on a weekly basis. And again, if the storage vessel is unloaded less frequently, then the AVO inspection shall be conducted before the storage vessel is unloaded. The owner or operator is required to actually inspect the vessel on a monthly basis to ensure compliance with the requirements of this part and to ensure the vessel does not have a leak. Paragraph C4 requires also the date and time stamp of the event. Paragraph 5 is again referencing the monitoring requirements that are applicable to that specific control device being used to comply with the emission standards in this part within section 115. And paragraph C6 is referring to the general monitoring requirements of section 112. Paragraph D contains the record keeping requirements of the monitoring events that are outlined in paragraph C. On a monthly basis, they shall maintain a record for each vessel of the identification number, the monthly liquid throughput, the average separator pressure, and then a calculation of the actual emissions of VOC emissions, and the controlled and uncontrolled VOC emissions in ton per year. Also the make, type, model, and ID of any control device used. There's also a requirement in paragraph D2 to record the liquid throughput and verify that by either a dated liquid level measurement, a dated delivery receipt from the purchaser of the hydrocarbon liquid, the actual metered volume of hydrocarbon liquid sent downstream, or some other type of proof of transfer. The owner operator shall also make a record of the inspections that are required under the monitoring. And those include a record of the date and time and a timestamp and GPS of location of the inspection, the person conducting the inspection, and a description of any problems observed and corrective action taken. Paragraph 4 again refers to the record keeping requirements of control devices used as required in section 115. And the paragraphs D5 refers to the general record keeping requirements of the general provisions that are found in 112. And then similarly for the reporting requirements, we are referencing those general reporting requirements for 115 and 112. There are no specific reporting requirements for storage vessels under this section. And that concludes this section.
Thank you, Ms. Keene, and that concludes the summary of the department's pre-filed testimony on storage vessels.
Thank you very much, Ms. Keene, Mr. Palmer, Ms. Katz. If you're a party and have questions of the department panel, please turn on your camera. Oh, I see Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer, and either Ms. Keene or Mr. Palmer can answer. I'll let them decide who the most appropriate person is. In discussing the proposed requirements for storage vessels, I think both of you alluded to NSPS requirements that may be applicable. Could you identify those NSPS requirements that apply to storage tanks?
Yes, there's Quad O and Quad O and which was superseded by Quad A, and those require new storage vessels with a PTE greater than 6 tons per year to control emissions by 95%.
And are any of these units that we're talking about subject to this hearing, subject, for example, to subpart K or KA or KB?
Yes, there may be tanks subject to K, KA, and KB as well.
And would you characterize the requirements you're proposing as being more stringent than those requirements, either KA or KB or Quad OA?
This section is more stringent in that it requires existing storage vessels to be subject to this part. So we're bringing in a significant number of storage vessels that have never had requirements to control those emissions. And KA and KB are, those are largely targeted towards floating roof tank requirements, and Quad O and Quad OA, again, only cover new units or existing units. So anything, I think, after August 2012 would have been covered under Quad O. And anything over September 2016 would be covered under Quad OA.
Thank you. And I just have a couple questions about the cost figures, and perhaps Mr. Palmer is the right person to ask. You identified a cost figure and cost per ton, and I'm trying to figure out, was that based on reductions that would be attained through the department's initial proposal, or has that been updated to include now the revised proposal that Ms. Bisbee-Keene alluded to earlier?
That is based on the cost per ton estimates in the 2016 CTG, and those then were scaled up. And then we applied those to the estimated emission reductions we would get in allowables.
And I guess my question was, the allowables as the rule was proposed initially, or as the rule is being revised?
As the rule is being revised. So we removed from our spreadsheet, cost spreadsheet, those tanks that were between 2 and 3 tons per year of allowables. So we just changed the filtering.
And
then based on that, we estimated the average cost per ton of the VOC allowables that were reduced.
And in terms of, excuse me, go ahead.
So just one more clarification. We also changed the percent reduction to 95 from 98 that we had for the larger tanks. So those are the 2 changes in the spreadsheet.
Okay, and that's addressed in I think both the presentation today and in your testimony. I think that's been submitted, correct?
I believe so.
And I think I've asked you before. My understanding is you, I don't know you personally, but you were responsible for providing the department's modeling experts with the emissions inventory that was modeled. Do you know whether the
Let me clarify that.
Sure, go ahead.
We were not responsible for providing the modeling inventory. We were responsible for estimating what we thought the emission reductions would be.
Okay, and do you know whether those the emission reductions we're talking about in the revised proposal today were evaluated as part of that modeling analysis?
No, the modeling was not updated for the changes in the September 16th version of the rule.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Mr. Heiser, I think I saw you turn on your camera. There you are.
Yeah, I have just a couple of questions. Ms. Keene, in your direct testimony on page 140 and control options for storage vessels, and I'll give you a moment because I see you're hunting for it. You talked about some of the advantages of recycling and recovery options. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that's really talking probably in most cases about a vapor recovery unit. Is that correct?
yes.
Um, did you evaluate as part of your consideration of this, the impacts of the department's other proposal in section 115 that requires that instead of a single VRU, you have to have two? And how that might impact this beneficial recycling and recovery option that you speak to here in page 140 of your testimony?
We did not specifically evaluate that a redundancy impacting the ability to recycle vapors.
But would that redundancy tend to increase the cost of the recycling or recovery option?
It would, but it would also increase the capture and recycling of the vapors during any VRU downtime. And so the reason for that is we have vapor recovery units that are operational on very limited amounts of time. And so the redundancy requirement was meant to cover those VRUs that are operating less than 95% of the time. And so that's all.
So did I understand correctly that the redundancy requirement is to ensure we meet the 95% requirement, but if you're able to meet that with a single VRU, you don't have to have a redundant VRU?
That's not exactly what the requirement says. It says you must meet at least 95% and then use a VRU as a backup when your first inline VRU goes down for maintenance.
Okay. And then in the rebuttal exhibit 1, where it's, I believe, both you and Mr. Palmer, and this is probably a Mr. Palmer question, in page 91, Mr. Rose just asked you some questions about the cost for that. And I was wondering, Mr. Palmer, if the 13,779 that you listed as the ton for a 2-ton per year tank, is that the 2-ton per year tank, or is that the 3-ton per year tank value? If you could just clarify that.
It says on my testimony, $13,779 per ton for a 2-ton per year tank.
Do you have the value that you got using the 3-ton per year tank available that you could share? That would be the current threshold the department's proposing.
Let me look here, sir. So in the cost spreadsheet from the CTG, which we have as Exhibit 100, there is a tab called Cost Factors. And it shows, this was from the CTG, and so it shows a 2-ton per year, 4-ton per year, 6-ton per year, so increments of 2. So there's actually not a value there for 3. There's a value for 2, which is $13,779. There's a value for 4, which is $6,890. But there's not a value for 3.
What was the value for 4?
$6,890.
And so you'd expect that 3 would then be someplace between the 6,890 and the 13,970.
I would expect that to be true.
Okay. Does the cost, did you evaluate whether the cost estimate varies depending on whether it's a single tank that we're controlling or if it's a multiple tank battery that we're controlling?
We estimated our costs, including a retrofit factor for tanks. It was the cost per tank. So we applied that retrofit factor for each tank.
Okay. Then on page 92 of your rebuttal exhibit, this question probably going to Ms. Keene. On line 18 of this page, Ms. Keene, you say that NMOGA proposes to exempt sources to other federal emission standards from the requirements of this section. NMED does not agree with this proposal. I think subsequent to this testimony, we had a discussion about the discovery of floating roof tanks. and that for those floating roof tanks, the department's current view is that they are looking for an SPS subpart KB for those floating roof tanks. Is that correct?
So we have not agreed that KB is an equivalent reduction to what Part 50 proposes to control. So I'm unsure about the question.
Yeah, I guess that in the earlier discussion of this issue, there had been a question about the control factors and whether or not the controls that were proposed here are appropriate for floating roof tanks because of the differences between how they're constructed, availability of vapor space, and routing to combustors. And it had been proposed that maybe those would continue to be regulated under the Part KB, which has specific provisions for floating roof tank controls. And I was just curious whether this statement that you're making here, because it predated that prior discussion, was meant to be read in light of your subsequent discussion in this hearing.
So that was the first time that issue has been brought up. I don't believe that any party provided any testimony that KB should be considered equivalent or an effective means of controlling emissions for those issues.
Mr. Palmer, then, if I can turn then to just this question about a KB tank. When you conducted the technical evaluation, do you know if the example controls that were used included the technical differences between a fixed roof tank and a floating roof tank and what was done?
Let me look at something here, if you can give me a minute or two.
Yes, certainly. And
I'm just
Mr.
trying
Treasurer,
to,
just wondering if you could, you're referring to some discussion of that issue, if you can maybe point out where that was or when that occurred.
well, there was a comment certainly that Moga had made about using KB. And then in this testimony, and I'm trying to remember when we were talking about the definition of tank batteries, Mr. Curtis reminds me that the question had come up about the floating roof tanks. And my goal here is really not to derail the hearing on this issue, but just to make sure that we're all thinking about them because they're a little bit different in how they're structured and controlled. And the department's done a lot of work, which I think is very appropriate for fixed roof tanks, and there's a lot of testimony on that. The question is about this other sort of universe. And I see Mr. Palmer is looking like maybe he's found something.
yeah, let me, what I'm trying to do is just refresh my memory on exactly how we handled KB and KA tanks and how many we have in our data.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just,
If it's agreeable to you, Mr. Palmer, I think most of my other questions are for Ms. Keene. Maybe I'll touch with her, well, and that would give you a time to look at what you're looking at, and then I'll come back to you on the KB question. Does that seem acceptable to everyone?
that's fine with me.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Keene, I had, I think, one question for you. There was a proposal, I think, from the commercial disposal group relating to supplemental fuel where the emissions from the tank are not sufficient to support the control device by itself, at least if it's a combustion control device. Do you tend to agree that where we would be adding significant emissions from the supplemental fuel requirements, that may be an appropriate case to take an alternative approach?
It may be. So first, we didn't receive any emissions data on those tanks, and we didn't receive any BTU content about those tanks' vapors. So we weren't able to evaluate either request because we didn't receive any data about those two pieces of information. We have an applicability threshold for existing tanks of 3 tons per year. That should handle those low emitting tanks if they are low emitting. We also have an off ramp of 2 tons per year for uncontrolled or for actual VOC emissions. And so If those low emitting tanks are emitting less than that amount, there's a clear off ramp from the rule for those requirements. In addition, we've had other parties tell us that there are alternative control devices that can be employed on these tanks that are not combustion based. And so instead of writing in another waiver for a control device via this rule, we've kept the control device agnostic and given owners and operators flexibility in the type of control device that they would need to employ.
Thank you for that explanation of the department's thinking on this issue. It's helpful for us. Mr. Palmer, that did not take quite as long as I thought it might, so I'm back to you.
I'm good. I'm good. So I'm looking at our data here, and so we, out of 2,000 tanks or so that were in our final reduction cost tab, and this goes back to the June 2nd spreadsheet that we provided. There are about 37 tanks that are marked KB, being subject to subpart KB. And we primarily looked at whether or not they had a add-on control device. And these are all, the 37 that I'm looking at are all marked uncontrolled or blank for control device. So I don't think we took into account floating roofs. So there's 37 in the data. It looks like about 30 or so of those we assigned a cost and emission reduction to. But there's, it's 37 out of 2,000. But because they were marked uncontrolled, we included them in the cost and emission reduction. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Palmer. How familiar are you with a floating roof tank? Because I don't want to ask you questions if you're not very familiar with them.
I've had some experience with those working on other niche app. Tangentially, it was not a direct thing. I was estimating costs and emission reductions and impacts for another rule, miscellaneous surface coating. But and then I was conferring with some of my colleagues who were working on the organic liquid distribution and also miscellaneous organic chemical manufacturing rules. So I understand the principle that you have a floating roof on top of the liquid, and that prevents evaporation. It eliminates a headspace, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Interior, exterior floating roofs. So yeah.
Let me ask my question, and then you can tell us whether you feel qualified to answer it or not, and that would be fine with me. And the question is that where I have a floating roof, and I think particularly for an external floating roof, would it not be very difficult to develop an effective closed vent system for that type of unit to route to a control device, which is sort of the model that, would you agree, is how the department looked at we would handle most of the tanks covered by this rulemaking?
I'm going to defer on that, but I think it would be easy to determine whether or not those closed vent systems and add-on controls are an appropriate control device, just basically looking at the control device literature. I think there's a lot out there. We could refer to that and not have to rely on my spur of the moment testimony at this time.
Very fair. Mr. Palmer, I appreciate your response to that. Ms. Keene as well, your clarifications and help in interpreting the rule. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Heiser. Is there any other party with questions? Please turn on your camera. No? I will turn then to questions from the board. While I'm doing that, if you're an attendee on this platform with a question, please reach out through chat. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis, do you have any questions?
Yes, and I'm just curious if we at the point where I can ask questions of, am I just asking questions of Ms. Keene or?
Both Ms. Keene and Mr. Palmer.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see here. I do have a couple of questions, just trying to sort through my notes here. What Oh, is the NMED going to be, there's a lot of talk about inspections of throughout this hearing, but I was looking at the part of the rule where it was discussing inspections of tanks specifically. Does the department have a form that they're looking at? Is there an outline of what that inspection should entail?
Madam Vice Chair, there's not a specific checklist, for instance, for owners and operators to use. It's an AVO inspection, so they would be, I imagine, you know, surveilling the unit for audiovisual olfactory instances. And then for the actual inspection, on the monthly inspection, they're actually inspecting the tank for leaks.
Okay, so at this point, you're leaving it up to the operators to determine what that inspection should look like as far as on paper and the specifics in that inspection.
Yeah, that's right. We haven't specified, other than that you conduct an AVO and you conduct an inspection for leaks. Beyond that, it's not specified.
Okay, and section 123, is it applicable to both? I'm assuming it is, but is it applicable to both production and disposal facilities?
It currently, yes, it is.
And what percentage of the facilities, I'm going to return back to the floating roof tanks. What percentage of production facilities are you seeing with floating roof tanks?
I would imagine it's, Madam Vice Chair, I would imagine it's very, very small.
Okay,
Very small number have floating roof tanks. Those are for larger tank batteries that, and there's specific exemptions in that rule for pressure and for volumetric capacity. And so I haven't seen those employed in the upstream sector, but maybe Mr. Palmer can add to that.
Am I still on? Yeah. I'm looking at the tank data that we actually have in the equipment spreadsheet, and a lot of those are under the agency interest type, which is a facility type description. A lot of those are oil and gas tank battery, bulk fuel storage. Some of them are production, but it looks like about half are bulk fuel storage, oil and gas tank battery. So that's, and some of them are companies listed as marketing. It's possible that some of them are fuel storage rather than oil and gas production. So although some of them, a lot of them, I'm looking at the SI description, and a lot of it is crude oil storage, condensate storage. So
I'm just sort out in my head here. How, of those facilities, how many of them would be under your Title V program? And would the facility apply, like, would both of these rules apply to a facility that would also be in Title V?
I'm looking at, there are not a lot of them are under Title V. Well, yeah, these are the ones that were in, for which we estimated costs. So there may be some that are already controlled and regulated that are under Title V.
Madam Chair, we could do that review. We could do that analysis of our permitting database and find out what portion of tanks are subject to KB and subject to Title V.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful in trying to kind of sort out some of this information for us. So thank you. I would appreciate that. And I don't have any more questions.
Madam Chair, or Madam Hearing Officer,
Mr. Heiser.
if the ones that I was specifically asking about, if that's helpful for the board, tend to be located either at the crude oil transport sector, so collection right before it goes into the transportation pipeline, or there might be, we're trying to run down whether there's any in a central delivery point, some of the very largest of those. That was where these questions came from, if that helps you, Madam Vice Chair, as to why we raised the concern.
Yes, and actually I understood what you were kind of alluding to there. And in my experience, I've seen floating roof tanks on extremely large facilities. And to give context here, you know, most production facilities are, you know, 5 to 8 500-barrel tanks, whereas the floating roof facilities are closer to the, you know, 46,000 barrel mark. So the scale is vastly different. So I was trying to sort out which one of these are subject to, you know, Title V and are have more stringent requirements, and then the, you know, what we've been talking about is closer to these smaller volumes in that sense. So that's really what I was trying to sort out as far as this discussion was going.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you both. Let's see. Member Cates? Oh, Member Bitzer?
No question, Chair. Thank you.
Okay.
Real quick, I guess this is for the state, at 20.2.50.123, paragraph B, it was one of your early slides. You have the schedule of dates. It was January 1st, 2024, then January 26th, and then January 28th for completion of the upgrades. And I was wondering if there was something magical about 24-month intervals, or if we could perhaps maybe tighten that schedule without the law of unintended consequences coming down, maybe go 18 months and have B section 1 subparagraph C start January 1st, 2027 instead of 2028. Just trying to imagine the scenario under which we attach 2 years for each interval. I mean, I understand wait until 2024, middle of 2024 to launch, get the industry time to financially and physically prepare and get it done. But once there's, and I know we're a big state compared to like Colorado in terms of demands on the supply chain. We're number 2, I guess, in the country now. But with that kind of lead time, you know, 25 and 27, it seems to be the supplier industry would be ready to ramp up enough to supply New Mexico producers. Just thinking out loud, is there something I'm missing in the 24-month intervals?
Member Bitzer, you are correct that there will be a supply chain issues, and I think I'm sure the other parties will put that out there. There are thousands and thousands of tanks in the tank universe that'll be subject to these requirements, more so than engines. And so there will be tank retrofit costs, ordering of control devices. There's going to be competition among manufacturers to manufacture those control devices on a timely basis. So there are real construction and logistical challenges to, I think, even probably having that infrastructure available to comply with these requirements. I think we'll hear, we need to put something in that is achievable, a timeline that's achievable given those constraints. So I think this is a reasonable starting point. but I'd like to hear from other stakeholders, and I'm sure they'll be presenting on what alternative timelines might be appropriate.
Fair enough. I just wanted to put that out there in terms of thinking a little outside the box, not being wedded to year increments necessarily. Maybe it needs to be more than 24 months, 30-month intervals, 2.5 years between. But if there's that many out there, but it's just, I just want to keep that eye on the prize in terms of getting this done as soon as practical. Fair. So thank you.
Thank you. Member Garcia?
Questions, thank you.
Thank you. Member Honker?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Katz? Oh, I see Mr. Jano. Mr. Jano?
In anticipation of the next point, Madam Hearing Officer.
Oh, all right. Ms. Katz, did any of that prompt redirect for you?
Just one quick question to address Vice Chair Trujillo Davis's questions about inspections and the documentation. Ms. Keen, are there record-keeping requirements in the rule that operators would have to follow, and that would capture the required information regarding those inspections?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Katz, Ms. Keen, and Mr. Palmer. Mr. Jano?
Madam Hearing Officer, we had mentioned in an email earlier that Mr. Holderman is not going to be available coming up here soon in the afternoon. If it's all the same to Mr. Heiser and Mr. Rose, we'd appreciate leading off on the industry side.
Alrighty, I'll pause for a moment in the event of some fierce objection from Mr. Heiser or Mr. Rose. No. All right, go ahead, Mr. Jano.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Mr. Holderman is here with me again today. His exhibits are Oxy Exhibit number 2 and Oxy Rebuttal Exhibit number 2. As with other sections, Oxy's concerns have largely been resolved in the September 16th submittal. We do have 2 points we'd like to talk about in direct and rebuttal here. First, proposed revision to the implementation timeline, and then second, support for the ENGO's proposal on vessel measurement. We'll turn it over to Mr. Holderman.
Mr. Holderman, this is the court reporter. I'm just going to ask you to keep your voice up for me.
Yes, ma'am. So, Mr. Holderman, if you would please, could you summarize your testimony on section 123?
Yes. Consistent with other sections, some of Oxy USA's concerns with this section have already been resolved for coordination and open dialogue with the department and other stakeholders, including EDF and the other ENGOs. For example, Oxy USA previously proposed modifications that would allow for use of alternative control technology for storage vessels with a PTE or actual emissions less than or equal to 5 tons per year. However, Oxy USA understands and appreciates the department's position that the definition of control device with its allowance for other control equipment or technologies approved by the department already addresses this concern. Accordingly, my testimony today will focus on the 2 remaining issues: an extended implementation timeline and incorporation of storage vessel measurement requirements. First, as it concerns the implementation timeline, more than 85% of Oxy USA's production in New Mexico comes from 19 facilities that were built after 2017 and already have storage vessels that are controlled pursuant to Quad OA requirements. The remaining storage vessels affected by this rule would account for only 15% of Oxy USA's production. The emissions impact of the phased-in retrofit or installation schedule on these lower emitting storage vessels would be minimal, but the resource demand to comply with the proposed rules timeframes would be significant. In light of these concerns, Oxy USA proposes a phase-in schedule that aligns with the engine retrofit schedule and would allow operators to prioritize additional emissions controls at higher production facilities while still accomplishing the department's emissions reduction goals. The department established a phase-in schedule for existing storage vessels in its September 16th proposal that would begin in 2024. While we appreciate the department's extension, we continue to believe that our proposed phase-in, which begins in 2025, is more appropriate. As I noted in my prior testimony, and as Ms. Keene just noted, the new equipment and retrofits required by these rules are substantial and subject to significant supply chain challenges. Steel shortages, component shortages, lack of skilled manufacturing labor, limited manufacturing capacity, lack of skilled installers, supply chain issues, and growing demand for similar equipment in other states all limit operators' abilities to timely meet the retrofit and installation requirements of these rules. At this point, there's simply not enough manufacturers, technicians, and laborers to meet this demand in the timeframe proposed. This is why Oxy USA believes it is critical to provide additional phase-in time that accounts for the realities of these resource restrictions. Without meaningful additional relief on these deadlines, Oxy USA and other operators run the risk of being out of compliance for reasons that are completely beyond their control. Moving to the second topic, as noted in my rebuttal technical testimony, Oxy USA supports the addition of the new storage vessel measurement requirements section to the rule, as advocated by EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA. This new section would require use of a storage vessel measurement system and establishes related operation, inspection, and training requirements. Oxy USA believes this addition is reasonable and helps to further emission reduction goals. Also, why Oxy USA believes the proposed new section is workable for Oxy USA's New Mexico operations. I can't say whether this is feasible for other operators in the state. I'm only speaking to Oxy USA's individual position.
Thank you. With that, we would present Mr. Holderman for cross-examination.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holderman and Mr. Jano. If you're a party with questions, please turn on your camera. Not seeing anyone. I will turn then to questions from the board. While I'm doing that, if you're an attendee on the platform with a question, please reach out through chat. Vice Chair Trio Davis.
I don't know if I'm liking this member Sweden not going first deal here.
She says she'll be back in about 3 minutes.
Oh, I'm just giving her a hard time here. But no, I don't have any questions right now. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Member Cates?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
You two did a lousy job of stalling for Suwina, just for the record. No, I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Garcia?
No questions, thank you.
And Member Hunker?
No questions, thank you.
Wow. All right, Mr. Holderman, you got off easy this time. Thank you very much for your testimony. Let's see. I think at this point we would return to NMOGA. As I understand it, Mr. Smitherman is not available today, but I did panelize Mr. Meyer. Is that where we're going, Mr. Heiser?
Yes, it would be Mr. Meyer.
All right. If you will join us. There he is. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. Welcome, Mr. Meyer. You've been previously sworn in this matter, is that correct?
That's correct.
You've adopted your testimony already?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you have any corrections to the testimony on storage vessels?
No, sir.
Okay. Your exhibits are found for the board's benefit in NMOGA Exhibit A2 for direct and NMOGA Exhibit 42 for rebuttal. And so if the board members would like to follow along, that would be appropriate. Did you prepare a summary of your direct and rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you like to share screen?
Absolutely.
And Madam Hearing Officer, I think he asked you that already, correct? Yes, she says you're ready to go.
I got it. Okay. Everyone see that?
Yes, you can make it a little bit bigger. Good.
Sure.
Perfect.
Okay.
Mr. Meyer, what are you going to be speaking to today?
So today I'm going to be speaking towards the Valor report and the direct testimony regarding storage vessels. By association, obviously, control devices and hydrocarbon loadout got rolled into that same report. So there may be some crossover here and there.
Okay, but basically your point is that in addition to the storage vessel, we also have to route the emissions to the control device, and so.
Right, yes, exactly.
All right, very good. Why don't we move on and see what you have to say.
Okay. So the Valor effort was to evaluate these various sections of the rule a couple months ago, and to do basically the end goal was to provide a cost estimate for that impact of the rule. In kind of high level, what we did was we used again a lot of the ERG cost estimating sheet, which was great, and made the adjustments where it was necessary based on our experience. So we took numbers that were associated with that study and extrapolated out using reports from the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program of what other tanks could be out there that maybe were not in the ERG summary. And the next step was to apply our expertise in storage vessel closed vent system analysis and come up with a cost estimate for those affected facilities. And then the last thing we did was to offer up an alternative rule applicability that may be a good compromise between the two sides here. So I thought it would be prudent to first go through a little bit of a background on closed vent system analysis. And I apologize ahead of time in this presentation. I use the term closed vent system and vapor control system kind of synonymously. So you'll see CVS and you'll see VCS. They're one and the same. So go ahead, Mr. Heiser.
So you're going to now go through sort of how the costs are developed for a combined tank and control system. Is that correct?
Correct. As the rule was, it's all encompassing, capture of vapors during truck loadout and control devices, as well as the storage tanks, and they all kind of get rolled into one. So a little bit about closed vent system analysis for storage tanks is that it can be much more costly than most people think. I think in the ERG cost estimate sheet, there was an assumption of like one combustor for a tank, and then that could be used for many tanks, that same combustor for a battery of multiple tanks. That assumption is sometimes not true. Because at the end of the ultimate goal, and this is bullet point 2, is that what we're trying to do is design or evaluate these closed vent systems so to prevent tank pressures from reaching a leak point of thief hatches or relief devices. So in order to prevent that, there's a lot of things we have to consider. There's some common terms that you're used in this context. PPIVFR, which stands for peak potential instantaneous vapor flow rate. So that is a momentary flow rate of vapors that are either created by or enter into the tank system. So I think as NMED had pointed out before, there are flash vapors and working vapors and thermal breathing vapors. Another big point is available headspace, as we call it, in the tanks. A tank that is completely full, if you can imagine, has no vapor space. If I throw just a little bit of gas into that, it has a propensity for the pressure to go up pretty quickly. So the point that we were making in our Valor memo was to illustrate that, but say that potentially single standalone tanks in New Mexico could be hardest hit from these rules because they don't have a lot of headspace to absorb flash vapors. And so with those two things considered, and there's other factors to consider, of course, but with those two main points, it always becomes a balancing act of modifying the upstream facility to reduce flow rates into the tanks, or to add additional capacity of the closed vent system and associated control device. And also, I don't have this in here, but tank level control becomes very critical. So what we were, when you evaluate these, the requirement is to do a closed vent system analysis, and it's been loosely defined. However, if we look to more recent consent decrees on the subject, there's kind of been this precedent set of that you have to evaluate the adequacy of the CVS by assuming that all non-precluded tank inputs operate simultaneously. And so what non-precluded means is any input that can at any time go open and flow liquids or vapors into the tank, you have to assume that it does along the same time that all the other inputs go in. This is it's kind of an improbable event. Again, another 100-year flood type of situation. But what it can do is create the need, at least on paper, the need for a larger capacity control device or vapor control system that you really don't need. So on this next slide here, I'm trying to illustrate that problem. So this is a tank battery where we had to simulate all the inputs to the tank system that could, although unlikely, could go flow liquids or vapors into the tanks simultaneously. We had to assume that they did so at time 0. And so you see this huge pressure spike. This is modeled, right? This is not reality. But this is a huge pressure spike that is a probably very unlikely event in the life of this battery. So then you have this post time 0, this time where the pressure is actually modeled to be very low, because this is more realistic to operations, right? I wasn't modeling these other inputs going on and on and on continuously. So what this results in summary of this is that it could result in a larger capacity control device than would have otherwise be thought, just because of a precedent set in recent negotiations.
So before you move on, Mr. Meyer, let's leave that slide up and talk about that. So your testimony basically is that you believe that we should be designing tanks for some place that's lower than this initial giant spike that you're showing, that your testimony is basically is unlikely to ever occur, but instead we should be designing to cover that second highest spike with some margin of safety, and that would be a more appropriate way to design.
Absolutely. Yes, I think there needs to be more of a focus on likely events, not peak, all improbable events.
Now, were you here during the prior testimony by Ms. Keene from the Air Quality Bureau, where she spoke about the department looking to the sort of reasonably anticipated range of operations?
Yeah, I do hear that, and that it gives me encouragement. That reasonable range of operations is, what is reasonable to you may be different to me. So I although it's encouraging, I feel like I've heard that before, so to speak.
Right.
That makes sense.
And then let's talk then about the adverse consequence. Let's say that we've decided that we want to use this instantaneous rate, which is shown in that initial spike. What is the impact on the environment of sizing the control device for that point versus, to say, maybe the second bar up above that intermediate spike that we see?
Sure. The impact is that you have oversized control devices. that you're required to keep on a large, let's just say a large combustor on the site because a theoretical model tells you need to. But then in practice, in operations, that combustor is not flowing nearly that peak amount, and you have turn down issues. So that you're going to have efficiency issues at the low end of the pressure range.
Wasn't there, in fact, two approaches, Mr. Meyer, to resolve that? One would be to turn down the combustor, and the second would be to burn additional fuel in order to make up the BTU deficit.
Yes, you could add, you could add more gas to your tank system to make it up, or to the inlet of the combustor. But you basically have to try to cover that range of operations better. Ultimately what it means is that if you have a normal operations, you're actually creating more emissions from unburnt, hydrocarbon vapors, because 99% of the operation is operating, as you see, in the very low range. I think this has been acknowledged in other negotiations because it's been brought up having the concept of potential minimum vapor flow rate. So you have to also size for that. Well, the minimum is 0, right? There could be no vapors going to the flare or combustor, which means you would have an infinite turn down, which is going to be nearly impossible.
Okay, but to sort of focus here, your testimony as you're making it today is that you believe that reasonable range should accommodate the likely foreseeable peak to minimize potential excess emissions from having to add supplemental fuel or from inefficiencies that result from having a too large control device.
Right. There's middle grounds for sure.
Okay. Why don't we move to the next slide?
Okay. So with that in mind, that there is a potential for oversizing of equipment, there are instances where you actually do need bigger equipment than is reasonably thought to be needed. Again, a lot of times if you have tanks with low vapor space, head space, you do need a larger combustor, many times. So based on our experience, there's a kind of a size of combustor that we think is generally appropriate, or that as a minimum. So it's a larger combustor than you would think. And so with that comes a whole bunch of other additional costs associated with that larger combustor or control device. So, things that have to be added to the facility include like concrete pads or foundations for the control devices, and burner management systems, although they're kind of traditionally provided in the cost, there may be a requirement to have redundant BMS or redundant pilot systems. There's a lot of piping and flame arrestors and a lot of different equipment, solar backup to keep these things running. And some instances you need to do some gas conditioning. And one of the things that I brought up in the Valor memo was this potential that, for a lot of these smaller facilities or older facilities, the tanks may be rated for something much lower in pressure, so that they can't actually handle a lot of vapors without relieving out of the thief hatch. So a traditional API 12F tank is rated for 16 ounces of pressure. There are some tanks that are 8 ounces, and some of the older ones are 4 ounce rating. And then there's others that are just stamped as ATM, meaning atmospheric. Those latter two, they really can't handle a lot of pressure before they have to relieve out of their relief devices. So for the applicability of this rule, there are costs associated with replacing those storage vessels completely. So it's not just the combustor or even a bigger combustor. You have to maybe replace your tank. in order to comply.
And is
So-
that a greater problem with the single tank battery where you have very little headspace and you can't share headspace between multiple tanks?
Yes, yes. So the single standalone, in our assessment, was the hardest hit by the rules, or will be, unless there is some sort of carve out to it. And I think I've heard testimony about smaller operators and local communities depending on them, and the sites that are the single tanks will probably will not be cost effective for them to continue. That's just my opinion.
Okay. Did you hear the testimony from Mr. Holderman, the representative of Oxy USA? He was, I think, right before you.
Yes, I caught bits and pieces of it, yes.
And he discussed some concerns he had about supply chain issues and availability of materials for these tanks installations. Do you have any similar concerns?
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Just steel in general is hard to come by. So there will be, if people have to replace tanks as a result of this rule, there will be a timeline issue for sure.
And are you generally sympathetic then to the suggestions of Mr. Holderman that some sort of implementation schedule is appropriate?
Yes, yes. Being more explicit, yeah.
Why don't we move on?
Okay. So there was a lot of cost information and details in the Valor report. But at the end of it, if you consider the rules in its entirety, hydrocarbon vapor capture during truck loadout, potential for a larger combustor or control device, replacing of tanks, all these things added up, you could have a significant cost associated with especially the smaller tank, single standalone tank batteries. Here's just a summary that was at the end of applicability of the 2 tons per year for existing storage vessels. I understand that this has been superseded by a newer red line. And so the last part that Valor did was to kind of offer up a happy medium here. And so what we had proposed was a 6 tons per year threshold. And when we did the math, again, using ERG's data as a baseline, we concluded that you can have a significant reduction in VOCs, but for a much cheaper price tag to the industry. And I would go as far to say that, maybe something to consider is, yes, the 6 tons per year, but possibly have a whole carve out for single standalone tank batteries and make their applicability a little higher.
And basically your point in that slide is to show that depending where you sit it, there may be a much greater cost reduction than there is a loss in VOC reduction.
Yeah, I think there will be a tipping point or a point of diminishing returns, I'd say.
Okay. All right. Please continue.
The remainder of these is regarding the rebuttals, so clarifications. This came down to, why adding the term tank battery as a definition. We believed it was necessary just because it was used throughout the rules. And, tank battery in New Mexico may mean something different in Colorado, for example. So we thought that was prudent. We also thought it was appropriate when it came to truck vapor capture to say that vapors need to be returned to the tank battery, not necessarily the individual tank that you're loading out from.
And that's because it allows you to take advantage of the combined headspace and thus reduce the pressure requirement.
But to me, it didn't matter. It was too explicit to say you got to put the vapors directly back into the tank you're loading out from. doesn't matter where I send the vapors as long as I'm controlling them. Right.
Or when they're all manifolded together. Yeah.
Correct. And the last portion, which was on rebuttal for auto gauging, there was the thought of adding, requiring level transmitters or other kind of auto gauging to to all tanks. And what we wanted to kind of point out is we believe that auto gauging for new storage vessels, newly procured storage vessels for new facilities, we completely support that. But we wanted to put a little asterisk on that to say, what if you're modifying an existing tank battery and adding a new storage tank or replacing one? There should not be a requirement to have auto gauging for that replacement tank, because it would, in our opinion, it would create some confusion between truckers, where they may have to say, should I manually gauge that tank, but this one I'm not allowed to? And it just seemed like an operational a nightmare to us. So it was our opinion to actually specifically have a carve out for that situation.
And so our position is that NMOGA is supportive of, for any new tank in a new storage battery context, we agree with auto gauging, but we don't believe it should apply to modifications of existing tanks.
Correct.
Okay. And then you had, I think, a comment about our concern about some of how the language read as it related to maintenance practices. Could you explain that concern?
I'm sorry, in what context?
The last bullet point.
The last one? Okay. Yeah, the last bullet point is that there was parts in the rule where it could be interpreted that you're not allowed to open these thief hatches ever. And I believe that we have to have that ability to perform maintenance, to clean them, to maintain them, without fear of ramifications. So.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Did you have any other topics that you wanted to address? Does that complete your direct and summary of your direct and rebuttal?
That completes my summary.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Madam Hearing Officer, will make him available for questions.
Thank you. And if you would shrink your screen there for a moment.
Stop
If
staring at it.
if you're a party with questions, please turn on your camera. I'm not seeing anyone. I'll turn then to the board for their questions. If you're an attendee on the platform with a question, please reach out through the chat. Madam Chair, do you have questions of Mr. Meyer?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. None at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
Yes, and glad Phoebe's back. Okay, Mr. Meyer, my question really, you were discussing in slide 5, I think it is 6, maybe. No, I'm sorry. Yes, it's definitely slide 6. I apologize. Sometimes it's difficult to see the slides on the zoomed in.
Mr. Meyer can bring it up again if that would be helpful.
Just about to do that. Okay.
It was there's a comment on there about the worst hit facilities are going to be standalone tank batteries, and I'm wondering, generally, aren't those standalone tank batteries dry gas wells or stripper wells?
Excellent question. And that is the common misconception, right? Is that because they're lower producing, if you were to totalize their emissions throughout the year, yes, they're a lower contributor, right? However, it's because in my world, we look at preventing overpressurization of the tanks to where thief hatches open. So say there's a facility with a separator, just a separator and a single tank. When that separator, it may not produce at all, maybe a half a barrel a day. But during that one time a day where the separator dumps from the dump valve, the amount of liquids or the flash vapors overwhelm that tank and it relieves out of its thief hatch. So the one thing to take away is just because a facility is low producing does not mean it's not going to vent. Sometimes it is, right, and we've found cases where that's where that's true, but production is not the same as flow rate, instantaneous flow rate. That's the takeaway. Does that make sense?
It does, but it leads me to a couple more questions. I've noticed we mentioned thief hatches a lot, but do these tanks generally have an Anardo valve on them?
So yeah, I think I use the term thief hatches because most people can relate to that. But there are tons of different types of relief devices that can be on tanks. An Anardo, what they call an EPRV, an emergency one, right? It's green. You may have seen that. Thief hatches, Anardo makes some, and there's a whole bunch of other manufacturers. And there's also relief devices by, Morrison Brothers, and they're all makes and models. But at the end of it, what we do when we analyze these facilities is we look at the one that has the lowest setting. This one's set at 16 ounces, this one's set at 14, this one's set at 10. And we have to design the closed vent system and control device for that 10 ounce one, because that's the one that's going to go first.
Okay, so the Anardo should go before the thief hatch, correct?
There's so there's a lot of depending on what engineer you talk to, some set them that way, some set them the other way, where the thief hatch goes first, and then the Anardo, as you call it, the
PRV,
the emergency one, we'll call it that. The emergency relief valve goes second. When I design them, I design for the emergency one to go first, and not the thief hatch, because I know how finicky the thief hatches can be.
Okay, but my original train of thought on asking you about these single standalone batteries, I believe there is a cutoff or carve out in the rule for them and let me pull the rule back up here. I have so many tabs open at this point in this hearing. That there are two that exist, one for how many times it's unloaded and I apologize now that I'm looking at it, I'm finding it difficult to find them.
I think you're referring to the truck vapor capture being required only for a tank battery that has had X number, 12 or 13 loadouts in a time period. Is that a year, I want to say?
I think it says a month if it's only unloaded more than once a month, or less frequently than monthly.
Right.
And then I know that there was another provision for dry gas wells that was less than 2 tons per year. So that should have less than 2 tons per year, I'm thinking.
That's the applicability. Yeah, so let's look at the truck loadout one first. So hauling once a month, right? You still that is an added cost, right, to add that line and the vapor balance line. And well, actually, before I say that, let me say that the cost estimates I'm presenting here were from the first draft, not what has been modified since, right? So that 12 loadouts, this cost estimate was before that, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, but let's just put the truck vapor capture system aside, because in theory, you could easily remove, now with the new rule, the new red lines, we don't, we could actually vapor balance now. Before it was you had to send the vapors to another combustor. And also the, water, we don't have to capture water truck vapors now for the new red line, the 916 version. So that's a huge, that's a huge win. But still, for these small single tank batteries, it all comes down to that headspace. I don't have enough headspace to absorb a lot of flash. So usually the debate becomes, you can change trim sizes on valves, like make valves smaller that are flowing into it, or you make your closed vapor capture system bigger. We've even gone down the route of adding a whole nother stage of separation between the facility and the tank to dampen out any pressure spikes in that single tank. So the modifications that, from our opinion and what we know and have seen, the modifications may be greatly disproportional for a single tank battery right now, even with the new 3 tons per year applicability.
Okay, that kind of clears up some of that testimony for me. And then the last question I had was on the spikes that you were showing on slide 5.
Sure.
And let me pull that back up. Or you've got it up. There it goes.
Yeah.
So the spike, the first spike, and again, I have a little hard time seeing the detail in your graphs, so that's really what I'm asking about. But that spike, is that coming on when you bring a well on, that first bit of heavy flow that comes at the beginning of a well being turned on?
No, this is a byproduct of, it's very difficult to do a theoretical dynamic model. That's what you're looking at right now. And you got to kind of start at some time, right? And so you just pick an arbitrary time in the life of the facility, or usually it's how is the facility being operated right now. But when I model it, I have to model as if I have a main separator that's flowing and flowing to the tanks, but say I have a gas scrubber that's over there and it has a dump valve. And then over there is a pneumatic pump. And over there is some other piece of equipment, all of which are piped into the tanks. From a modeling perspective, we have to assume that they all dump at once. That's what that initial spike represents, is this idea that you have to, the precedent being set in these consent decrees, that you have to model as if they all go off together at time 0. And that's where what this spike in this graph represents. That if I model that I start all the valves to open at time 0, and then the remaining of this graph, they're just kind of going on their own, in the model, it's unlikely that they will ever sync up again to dump all at the same time. There's a second spike you see here, a little lower one, around 5 ounces.
Mm-hmm.
That may be a spike from a miscellaneous gas scrubber. It dumps to the tank.
Do you model for a hung up valve?
Say again, I'm sorry?
Do you model for a valve that's been hung up?
No, we tend to not model failures and malfunctions. Because in that case, that's what the hatches and relief devices on the tanks are for. They're there to prevent a tank explosion due to a what we call a gas blow-by event. So these models are never run with malfunction considered.
Okay. And are these engineered to dumped at the same time, like you were saying in that first initial spike? Are these devices engineered to do that?
It becomes a discussion of what's the probability of that happening. It's very improbable that they will. However, the precedent set in recent consent decrees is that you have to model as if they do.
Okay. Okay, thank you for answering my questions. I don't have any.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Member Cates?
No questions here. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Member Garcia?
No questions, thank you.
And Member Honker?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Will there be any redirect? Mr. Heiser?
I can't get myself unmuted. I guess I just have one question for Mr. Meyer back on slide 6, which we spent some time on. At the bottom of this slide, there's a comment, and I just want to make sure that you talked there about a single standalone tank battery. But what you're really talking about is a single tank, which is the only tank in a tank battery. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. Just sitting out in the facility by itself. Yep.
All right. That was my only question, was to make sure it was clear what you meant by that term.
Gotcha.
Anything else, Madam Hearing Officer?
Thank you very much, Mr. Heiser. Thank you, Mr. Meyer, for your testimony.
Thank you.
Let's see, it's 11:46. We are close to needing a break. We're also close to lunch. Let me ask Ms. Katz. Actually, first let me confirm with Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose, it wasn't clear to me whether we'd be hearing from Mr. Davis or Mr. Brown.
Madam Hearing Officer, with respect to the storage vessels, I don't believe that Mr. Davis actually testified on those. I think his direct and rebuttal go to loadouts and other equipment, but not the tanks. And as to Mr. Brown, as I indicated before, his testimony was related to general requirements in section 112. That's the record keeping and reporting. And that section is referenced in this one. So I guess his testimony goes to this to some extent, but it's addressed in his comments on section 112 as they apply. So we had not intended to offer any additional testimony on this item.
Thank you. So then it seems we would go to Mr. Kim. Is that correct?
That's correct. This is Casey Schball.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Spall. All right. Do we have Mr. Kim on the platform?
Yes, you do.
Oh, terrific. Shall we do that before a short lunch break?
That would be fine.
All right. I see you on the screen, Mr. Kim. Hello. And Ms. Spall, you can be on camera or not, depending on your bandwidth.
Okay. Mr. Kim has previously testified, and so he's been sworn in. His testimony is under Appendix A for direct and Appendix A for rebuttal for the Commercial Disposal Group. And Mr. Kim, the department has developed a definition of storage vessel under section 20.2.5.7 RR. Do you agree with that definition, or do you have a recommendation for that definition?
Yes, I do. But before I start, can I get sharing capabilities so I can share my screen for some of our PowerPoint slides? Thank you. And is that coming up for everybody?
It is.
Awesome. Yes, the group agrees with the definition of storage vessel and simply recommends adding numbers to the list of the types of vessels not included in the definition for ease of understanding as shown in this slide. As you can see on the slide, starting with a storage vessel does not include one, a vessel that is skid mounted or permanently attached to a mobile source and located at the site for less than 180 consecutive days, such as a truck or rail car. Two, a process vessel such as a surge control vessel, bottom receiver, or knockout vessel. Or three, a pressure vessel designed to operate in excess of 204.9 kilopascals without emissions to the atmosphere. And the reason for the request is just ease of understanding.
Thank you. What comments do you have regarding the applicability section of 123A?
As stated in my direct testimony, Section 123 imposes emission control requirements in relation to storage vessels which are technically infeasible where the use of supplemental fuel is required. The group is concerned that facilities with very low emissions could end up increasing total VOC and NOx emissions with the use of supplemental fuel in order to combust the vapors. As we have emphasized throughout our testimony, both written and oral, due to low hydrocarbon concentrations in the vapor stream, our group's facilities are not already controlled like E&P facilities, and therefore would require significant modification to achieve capture and combustion efficiencies for both storage tanks and hydrocarbon liquid loadout. We'll move to slide 2. In addition, it is important to understand that the low BTU content and high moisture content of the vapors from which the tank would not be able to combust without supplemental fuel. The vapors from these tanks are not the same as from a well site. The vapors are highly diluted and have high moisture content, thus supplemental fuel is needed for combustion. A Cimarron letter discussing the need for supplemental fuel at streams with high moisture content are attached as attachment D in my direct testimony. Slide 2 is the letter which was given to us by Cimarron. It shows that the type of vapors in our processes with high moisture content, they would require about 1,200 BTU per standard cubic feet for 95% combustion efficiency. This does vary a case-by-case basis, and this would be something we would end up doing sampling with, and then seeing how much supplemental fuel would need to be added to the combustor for a combustion efficiency of 95%. And these modifications are costly and may not result in any VOC reductions. In total, the capital cost could be over $500,000 per site with an annual operation and maintenance cost of $40,000. The calculated cost to control VOCs in dollars per ton would be roughly $28,657.85 per ton of VOC controlled. A detailed cost estimate of economic impacts of this section of proposed rules as applied to the group's facilities is attached to my direct testimony as attachment E.
Mr. Kim, do you suggest a different approach to regulating storage vessels where the use of air pollution control equipment would not be technically feasible?
The group supports NMED's language from its latest proposal on September 16th, 2021, regarding the applicability of the requirements of Section 20.2.50.123 NMAC to new storage vessels with an uncontrolled PTE equal to or greater than 2 tons per year of VOCs and existing storage vessels with a PTE equal to or greater than 3 tons per year of VOC, with one exception. Based on NMED's comments during the hearing, we are asking the board to consider a modification to our rebuttal testimony to move a statement from our new section, from our new section B9 to section A.
And do you have specific suggestions for transferring that section into section A?
Yes, we are proposing that one of the following provisions be added to section 123A as a second paragraph. We have given two options. We are more in favor of option one, but have decided to put up both options for a representation of what could possibly be. Option one, storage vessels are not subject to section 123B, where the use of air pollution control technology would be technically infeasible for reasons including, but not limited to, the inability to operate without supplemental fuel. The department can request information at any time regarding the owners or operators' infeasibility calculations, or storage vessels for which vapors do not meet minimum BTU values for the combustion device based on manufacturer's specifications are not subject to 123B. With either of these changes, we would no longer propose our addition of section 123.B.9. This language would apply to storage vessels with very low hydrocarbon concentrations, where there are technical difficulties associated with bringing in supplemental fuel to operate the control devices.
Do you have any other concerns with this section?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Kim is now available for cross.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schwal and Mr. Kim. Let me ask you to minimize your screen for just a moment. Thank you. If you're a party with questions of Mr. Kim, please turn on your camera. Not seeing anyone. Turn to the board for their questions. While I'm doing that, if you're an attendee on this platform, please reach out through chat with any questions. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. And thank you, Mr. Kim, for your presentation and going through the evolution of the latest language and your and also the presentation of your last recommendation. I just wanted to have a quick question in terms of processes. So this language was already shared with the New Mexico Environmental Department as part of this proceeding, is that correct?
Casey, can you verify, but I believe we have? Casey, you're muted.
Okay. What I was saying is, yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The provisions that we had were just in a different subsection of what we proposed, but the concept was in a previous iteration that we submitted with our testimony in the direct and the rebuttal.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Kim. Madam Hearing Officer, that's the only question I have.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kim. I just have one question. What kind of supplemental fuel would you have to purchase?
Yeah, so this would be brought in, delivered as a tank rental, and it would be propane, which is the most readily available fuel source for combustion that we would be able to receive in the field. But including with just the purchase of the supplemental fuel would be, the controls for that supplemental fuel, the fuel tank, and then the delivery once that tank has been emptied for more supplemental fuel to be added to the facility. That supplemental fuel would also be used to keep the pilot light lit in the combustor as well.
And as I understand it, the moisture content of the the dead oil that you were referencing, it fluctuates. Is that correct?
Yes, it does fluctuate. You know, what we've seen with sampling is because of our oil has been separated from a water stream, any of the per se working and breathing and very little flashing losses that would be considered that vapor does tend to have higher moisture content and less BTUs than you would see at a standard E&P type facility.
Okay, I guess what I was wondering is, would propane consistently allow you to achieve the combustion rates you are seeking?
Yes, the propane would. The difference would be the amount of propane needed based on our vapor in the tanks being routed to the combustion device. So that is going to be the difference. And that has to be done on a basis or a site-by-site calculation. But yes, you could flood essentially any stream with dry propane to get it up to the combustion efficiencies that you would need.
Would that take continuous monitoring, or would that just be a, you know, regular inspection to make sure you're getting your combustion rates?
So that would, I think it would all depend. Again, it's going to be a facility by facility type basis, but you could essentially design for worst case scenario. And anytime that there is a, per se, a dump or a flow of vapor to the combustor, then you would just do worst case scenario, and essentially it would be considered flooding the system with propane to get that combustion up to the 95%, as well as to have a smokeless combustor.
So I didn't think of this till now, but it sounds like you could end up burning more fuel or more supplemental fuel than you may have intended to.
Correct. And that's just because of the slight changing nature of what's being sent to the combustor. And we've touched on this subject in our direct testimony and our rebuttal. Just that, you know, supplemental fuel would need to be added in our circumstances to control storage tanks and hydrocarbon liquid loadout.
Thank you, and I apologize for asking more than one question because I so. But
It's all good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Member Cates?
No questions here. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
No questions, thanks.
Member Garcia?
No questions, thank you.
And Member Hunker?
Yes, one question, and you may have covered this and I may have missed it, but how does the potential to emit calculate for these kind of facilities that you're talking about?
So the PTE is calculated very similarly as EMP site, but what it fails to do is to actually calculate or give evidence that the vapor streams are actually high enough in BTU and low enough in moisture content to be able to combust it effectively without having to add supplemental fuel or add other pieces of equipment to get that waste gas or vapor into a combustible state. And so 2 tons per year at our facility essentially would look very different than 2 tons per year at an EMP site.
Okay, and I think second question for me, I too said I only had one, but I think it was Mr. Meyer tossed out the idea of a 6 ton per year threshold rather than 2 tons per year. Would that favorably impact your facilities?
I do not believe it would actually favorably impact our facilities from the stance of being able to combust our vapors. You know, we're not worried really about having a 2 ton versus a 5 ton versus a 10 ton, but we're more concerned with the fact that we actually just can't combust our vapors without having that supplemental fuel on site.
Okay, understood. Thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Honker. So let's see, it's a little bit after noon. What I'd like to do is to confirm the order of the upcoming witnesses. And thank you, Mr. Kim and Ms. Spall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we don't have the EDF witness we would otherwise hear from, I think, at this point. We'll have him tomorrow. Do I understand Ms. Fox will be going to Mr. McCabe?
Madam Hearing Officer, David Bach here. We are prepared from Dr. McCabe. We also have Dr. Orozco, who's has about 8 minutes on engines that we would like to take out of order if at all possible.
Okay, is he on the platform right now?
I don't believe he's on right now. We were thinking right after lunch, but I could call him if need be. Were you thinking of doing Dr. McCabe right now? We might be able to do that.
No, I'm just wondering the best use of our time. I don't have a preference one way or another. Let me hear from Ms. Katz.
I would think if there was a witness that had a very short presentation that we could do that now and get it over with, but sounds like there might be availability issues.
All right, so Mr. Bach, if you have a short witness, I'd love to do that.
Let me give him a call right now and see if we can get him on here.
Thank you.
Madam Hearing Officer, may I raise a logistical or procedural issue?
Yes.
So I think we're about to go into Clean Air Advocates engines and turbines SIR rebuttal, if that is what I understand. Is that right?
I do understand that if it's Mr. Orozco, if it's Dr. McCabe.
correct.
Okay.
Thank you. So I figure I would raise this here so we can use this time. But Kinder Morgan would like to enter an objection to Clean Air Advocates' proposed Exhibit 28. They did not offer direct or rebuttal testimony on the topic of engines and turbines. And while we recognize that they characterize this as SIR rebuttal, this is a 90-page report that was served on the parties, I think at 10:30 last night. So I think it's worth noting, that the language that they're SIR rebutting was filed September 7th and 16th. So there was ample time for Clean Air Advocates to notify the parties of this significant technical testimony and a new witness. And overall, this filing feels inconsistent with the approach to manage this hearing to avoid unfair surprises. And it's not reasonable to ask all of us to review this in that time frame. So perhaps, consistent with prior rulings, if anything, Clean Air Advocates should be limited to a proffer on Exhibit 28.
Let me ask Mr. Bach, perhaps, and we could certainly take Mr. Orozco after public comment at 1, for example, if that's consistent with his availability. But perhaps we could spend the next few moments on this objection from Kinder Morgan. And I believe there may be other parties who join this objection. Mr.
Yes,
Heiser?
we would have a similar concern, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, that was Mr. Heiser. Anyone else joining the objection?
As with the department, if the testimony pertains only to changes that were made in the September 16th version that was filed, that would potentially be, I think, acceptable for SIR rebuttal. But if it's anything beyond that, I would think, and then yes, the extensive exhibits, it doesn't seem to comport with the procedural requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Rose.
Yes, IPA&M would join in the objection as well.
All right, and Mr. Swift.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, the Gas Compressor Association will also join in the objection.
Thank you. Mr. Bach, you've heard the essence of the objection, and I certainly would agree with any distinction that was made between what was submitted perhaps in response to the department's Exhibit 23, namely its final-ish rule proposal. So I certainly understand the drive to do that, but if you would please respond to the objection as to all of the other material.
Yes, so thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. And we do recognize this is an unusual position for us to be in. However, I do think that the record shows that the department in its rebuttal made very extensive, very substantive changes to this provision. So there, we were fine with the provision going into the rule, which is why we didn't submit direct. And having seen these changes, we do have some concerns. That said, I do think when the parties hear the testimony, it's going to be similar to what the National Park Service had to say. It's not going to be as extensive as some might be worried about. We did want to provide that because that document, because Dr. Orozco will reference it, but I don't think I think that perhaps once his testimony is heard and it's understood that the focus really is of his testimony really is on changes that were made, saying you don't like this change that was made in rebuttal, you would like to go back to what was correct. When it's seen in the context of the testimony, I think that may allay some of the concerns about unfair surprise. I'm not trying to write a new rule that's different from what the department had introduced originally.
All right, Ms. Katz, Ms. Gutierrez, I'll ask for your opinion as well. Let me ask, if you were to draw a distinction along the lines of a proffer, what would that distinction be in these 90 pages? I'll confess I haven't read them myself yet.
I think that first Mr. Bach would need to specifically identify the particular change that that they are referring to. And then I still believe that that exhibit would not be appropriate. And so Mr. Orozco or Dr. Orozco could testify simply based on, could present his testimony if it's solely based on something that was changed either in the September 16th draft, or if they're saying it's something that the department changed in response in its rebuttal to the engine, in the oral testimony on the engine's provisions.
All right, thank you. Ms. Gutierrez, anything to add there?
I would just echo what Ms. Katz shared. It is a significant and lengthy document to have to parse, what applies to where is just not feasible in the next, lunch hour.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bach, let me ask if it is possible for you to chat with Dr. Orozco on the lunch hour. And I now don't know what his cutoff time is this afternoon. Doesn't have to be right after lunch. But chat with Dr. Orozco to identify those portions that relate, as Ms. Katz described, to either a change in the September 16th Exhibit 23 or to something that actually does represent rebuttal.
We certainly, Madam Hearing Officer, and I would sort of push back on the idea that their extensive stuff is not relevant. It seems to me that almost every standard was changed in this rebuttal. So the extent there's discussion of each different engine type, I think it all could be relevant. But we will confer on that.
All right, and I would certainly accept a proffer, as I did with Namoga. Certainly accept a proffer of all of it that is not clearly admissible. So thank you all for that. We've reached 12:14. Let's come back at 1 for public comment and see where we go from there.